ago, Hudson Foundation, and studying the same data that Harvey was talking about, looked at the talent issue. We're leaking talent in this state at a disproportionate rate. The Midwest is leaking talent. They're flowing to the coast for the most part. But in this part of the world, this part of Michigan in particular, we're leaking it faster than anybody else. It's a terrible challenge. If you look at Detroit and compare it to two other Great Lakes states, so weather isn't an issue. Compare it to Chicago and Illinois, and compare it to Minnesota or Minneapolis and Minnesota. If the region of Detroit had the same proportion of under 35 with a college degree as Minneapolis-St. Paul, we'd have 82,000 of that cohort. If we had the same size proportionally as Chicago, we'd have 132,000 of that cohort of under 35 with a college degree. The city of Detroit a few years ago had 15,000. And so the first conclusion people draw is, well, that's because it's Detroit, they went to the suburbs, right? No, the suburbs of Detroit, whether you're talking first ring or all the way out into a multi-county area, has half the density of that young population of Chicago or Minneapolis-St. Paul. So the bottom line is, if we don't turn this talent issue, whether we're talking about Detroit, Jackson, or Battle Creek, or Kalamazoo, if we don't turn the talent issue, nothing works. There's no tax base, there's no charitable volunteers, there's no contributions. We start to crumble, and we've got to flip that. And we started looking around the country at who was attracting talent, sometimes in cities that weren't working. And we took trips to, we went to Minneapolis, went to Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, we found the work of the University of Pennsylvania, which was run by a guy named Omar Blake, who founded U3 Ventures, and spent some time with them. There is a book out by Judith Rodin, the president at the time, called University and Urban Renewal. And it was the Bible for the work we were about to take on. So we embarked on what we thought was a talent strategy. And what we discovered several months in was it was a place-building strategy. Talent won't come if the place won't work. And there's a lot of things you can do in a talent strategy that seem to make sense. There's always talk about tuition forgiveness. Can we find creative ways to compensate differently? Can we do intern programs, etc.? Bottom line is they won't stay if the place doesn't work. And it would be easy for us to try to discount this into some simplistic types of work. The bottom line, though, is you've got to build the infrastructure and the place to bring the talent in to keep everything running. Back up 25 years from now, or from where we are today, go backwards. Midtown Detroit, which has been a Hudson Foundation investment place for that same time period, without an intermediary called the University Cultural Center Association, the bones disintegrate. That group, led mostly by Sue in that time frame, kept the major buildings of importance and the major infrastructure from crumbling or from being torn down, and has fought slumlords and people who've been vying for prospects but have no intention of developing for 25 years. So the story you're about to see is a 25-year overnight success story that resulted from keeping the bones in place so we could make this work happen. What we learned from U3 Ventures in West Philadelphia and then hired them was simply this. Anchor institutions, large employers with economic base that can't leave, they're anchored there. Usually talked about as utilities and healthcare systems and educational facilities and then some large businesses, have not been tapped for their economic potential and have not been coalesced around shared vision of place because simply they've been doing their business. Particularly when you add the nonprofit pieces in of the hospitals and universities, they can't exactly work on policy issues around neighborhood the same way that corporations can. And they've always been somewhat pigeonholed because they're beholden on public support in many cases. So they've not been looked at as economic engines for neighborhood development. But the bottom line is this. Take your anchor institutions. Where they decide to incent their employees to live, how they decide to buy their goods, and how they behave in the neighborhood they live in will determine the fate of the district, the neighborhood, or the downtown in which they're anchored. So if you can think of anchor institutions as an economic power instead of as an educational institution or a utility or a hospital, think about the impact you could have if you were to concentrate and densify resources around the issue of place building. So here are the big learnings, and then I'm going to turn this over to Sue to get into detail. I would say that we've learned 5 things through this process. First, the importance of clarifying self-interest for those institutions. It is about self-interest of anchors. It's about attracting talent to fill the positions you have or will have in the future, and it's about keeping the neighborhood viable and keeping the people close to the neighborhood working with you on safety and culture and what the neighborhood looks like, which makes it a more appealing place to be. 3 anchors in Midtown: Detroit Medical Center, Henry Ford Health Systems, and Wayne State University. When we set out on this journey, the first thing we noted was Wayne State and the DMC had been in battle for years. Harvey, I think when we called the first meeting of then Jay Noreen, the president of Wayne, and Mike Duggan, the president of Detroit Medical Center, it's the first time the 2 presidents had sit in the same room to talk about anything other than the medical school where DMC would take the residents. The only time they talked about anything other than that, and they fought like hell about it all the time, in more than 40 years. Reading the peace talks of Korea, I'm not making this up. How do you get 2 mortal enemies in the room talk about peace? We developed a strategy where essentially we had a private meeting with a good bottle of wine, and I learned both men had played soccer and coached soccer. So for 45 minutes, we talked about soccer and tried to build some trust and actually got them to agree on doing some of this work together. And we added Henry Ford Health Systems after. But I wanted this issue of clarifying self-interest is critical. Until they could all 3 institution CEOs agree on what their self-interest was and their role in it, we could not move forward and inspire shared vision. So that clarifying self-interest thing, you can't overlook it. It took us 8 months of meetings with the 3 to fully clarify self-interest and strategy. And then a data gathering process that took another 6 months. So this is a long-term strategy of working in the anchor. Second lesson, you have to have a champion who's holding an inspired shared vision. Somebody's got to keep reminding these folks of why you're in this. And we found that to be the role of Hudson Weber. So what we did is every quarter we had the 3 CEOs back in the same room to talk about progress. And each one of them placed on Sue's board a person who was essentially on the board with Sue working on the nitty-gritty stuff while they sit over essentially the progress. But this inspired vision has to have a champion that's constantly asking the questions and pushing back on the institutions as they start to drift away from what they originally agreed upon. Third issue, seeding programs. You can't seed programs till you do the first 2. I'm a foundation guy. We've been doing it backwards for years. I don't know how many of you work with foundations. I know Carolyn is. And so here's how foundations work because they have a pot of money. They think they're very smart. I'm a foundation CEO, and I can talk about our arrogance. And so I can write a check to you. So I have essentially a seed I want to give you. I want you to plant because I have an inspired shared vision, and it's certainly in your self-interest since I'm handing you a check to do it my way. And what happens is, as soon as the money runs out, the program dies. So until you do the first 2, don't seed programs because they'll die. And the first program we seeded was LIVE, which Sue will talk about, which incented employees to move into the district around their institutions. The momentum was so great because of what had been put in place before and the demand of the young talent that the corporations in downtown wanted to mirror the program. We said to them, we would like you to wait 6 more months. We've only been at 6 months. We want to see what the pilot does. And Dan Lepp of Blue Cross Blue Shield said, I'll give you 30 days. Then we'll do it by ourselves. And the only thing worse than the arrogance of foundation CEOs is the arrogance of CEOs of large corporations. So we said to Dan, we think you'll screw this up, so we'll help you. But only if Sue Mosey's operating it. So we were able to essentially leverage that. The fourth and perhaps most important lesson. None of this work will move forward without a strong intermediary. Without a strong and at capacity intermediary, the work can't move forward. Another flaw of community development and philanthropy, we have a great idea and we don't want to fund the core operations of the group. We intend to carry the idea forward. When we started this work, Sue was running the University Cultural Center Association with a budget of about $800,000. To the north was an institution called New Center Council with a budget of about $500,000. And we facilitated a merger. It took another 8 months to facilitate that and cost the Hudson Weber Foundation about $250,000 to make the merger. But it was critical to get the two institutions in the geography with one strong intermediary. And then we actually took what was a combined budget of about 1.2 to 1.3 million and upped it to 2.8, 2.9 million. And did that through the anchor institutions committing. So two of the anchor institutions have committed $500,000 per year to this intermediary for 5 years. Without that capacity inside of Sue's shop, now an organization called Midtown Detroit Inc., we can't move any of this forward. And we tend to undersell, especially when we talk about nonprofits, the need for good, talented staff that's in place. The intermediary also has to have a staff that can deal with the creativity of the space. Sue's also an events manager. She has events in that district that give it character, drive its culture, and drive talent in. So as you'll see, she's multi-talented in that respect. And the third component that's absolutely critical to the intermediary is they have to understand the development world. Sue is a deal maker as well as, in many cases, a partner in development, an actual developer in Midtown. And you have to have both. If you spend time, I know a couple of you toured with Sue, she knows the disposition of every parcel in Midtown Detroit and who's thinking about developing it and who she needs to help develop each one of those parcels. There's not a development deal in Midtown that doesn't go forward without Sue being knowledgeable of it and usually a large part of it. So, strong intermediary that has capacity of staff, a creative piece, and this development experience and deal doer possibility. And finally, the fifth lesson, it's got to be a long-term commitment. 25-year overnight success story in Midtown, and I would say Sue's budget right now is still $300,000 to $500,000 too small because we can't implement 2 or 3 programs that are necessary. So we've got to keep pushing the anchors, keep driving commitment and investment in, and we're in this for the long haul. We've been in it for 25 years. It's our intention not to get out. But the partners we drag in with us, we tell them it's at least a 5 to 10 year process. And it's our, as the holder of the vision, in essence, the champion of the vision.